Greetings, everybody. I'm Susan Clinton, and I'm here with Gilletta Belton and Carolyn Van Dicken, and we are the Genius Project, here to bring you project number 5, pain education and the challenges and pitfalls that we all run into with this. Our guest speaker is Mike Stewart for this project, and we are going to give you an overview about some of those challenges and pitfalls of education with pain neuroscience.
All right. Thank you, Susan. So let's take this away. And the first thing we want to really sort of sink our teeth into a little bit is the patient's perspective on pain science education. And no one can speak to that better at this point than Gilletta. So I'm going to turn that over to Gilletta for just a moment, because I think one of the comments I hear from physiotherapists is I don't do pain education because my patients don't want it, or I feel like when I do pain education, they just think I'm saying it's in their head, and that's sort of the big fear that comes up. So I would love to hear, Gilletta, your perspective on maybe what pain education was able to do for you in your journey, and what role you think it plays in the patient's lived experience of pain.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, and I had a unique exposure to pain, science education, because I was kind of doing it on my own and searching for this information on my own. So I didn't have someone telling me this information, but I have some thoughts onto how perhaps we can do that a little bit better. Because after I learned pain science myself, I started trying to fire hose people with pain science information. Anyone that had pain, I tried to tell them all the things that I knew about pain. But for me, from my perspective, when I started learning about the biology of pain, it really validated my experience. Because I had all of these explanations leading up to me seeking out this information that didn't make sense and that didn't resolve my issues, and that weren't the answer. I would be told it was my posture or my biomechanics, and I had surgery, and in all of these different things that had these very biomedical explanations for my pain, but the solutions to those biomedical explanations never solved my pain. And I didn't understand why until I started understanding the biology of pain a little bit differently. And understanding that my pain was very real. And I think that's what some of the resistance is from patients too, that if you start to talk about the brain and neuroplasticity, it sounds like you're saying it's all in their head, and that's where the resistance comes from, rather than understanding pain as being very real and based in biology, and that our nervous system is a part of our biology, and our thoughts and behaviors and actions and emotions are all a part of our biology too. So for me, understanding that my pain was very real and based in biology was very validating, and it helped me make sense of my experience that I hadn't been able to make sense of up until that point. And it changed the meanings of my pain. It was no longer so threatening. It no longer meant that my joint was being destroyed and damaged and like irrecoverable in terms of what was going on in there. Because to me, having surgery was supposed to fix it, and then the pain persisted after that. So what did that mean? Did it mean I messed up my surgery? Am I just, re-injuring myself every time I experienced this pain? So it changed the meanings of what that pain was. And through having a different understanding of pain, and through it not being so threatening, not just to my hip, but to like my very being, my life was no longer on hold. I was able to get back to doing the things that I love to do and get back to the things that mattered to me. So it was this whole process of just feeling validated, understanding pain differently, and that it was very real, just real in a different sense than I had come to believe, and how that changed the meanings of that pain experience over time and allowed me to get back to my life.
So it sounds like for you, it was a game changer, and was actually the complete opposite to what a lot of physiotherapists or a lot of clinicians fear, in that it's actually going to turn patients off, right? So
Right.
that's interesting. So maybe what we need to do is explore why we feel like we're going to turn patients off with taking this road, and look at some of the barriers that we experience as clinicians to providing pain education. So thanks for setting the stage for that, Gilletta. That was really helpful. So let's look at some barriers. And I think one of the first ones is something that I've alluded to already here, and that really is just cognitive dissonance. So when there's cognitive dissonance, basically you are you are presenting information that is in direct opposition to your patient's core beliefs, right? So their core beliefs are that pain is structural, that we need to take a biomechanical or biomedical model. And so recognizing that when that happens, we need to really just take a step back and say, okay, this we're going to need to chip away at. This is not something that we're going to be able to, just sort of have an hour's conversation about pain and expect that their core beliefs are going to change. Susan, do you have any comments, or have you had any?
I do, and I love this slide because I think it demonstrates a lot of what actually occurs when you have a conversation. And when faced with even the evidence that maybe their core beliefs or their conformational biases are strong, are wrong, people tend to dig down into them deeper. It's a security thing until they can begin to unravel it. But when you have conflicts and you're talking about, are their values under threat, there's a conflict that's set up with them. And conflict in that way leads to ambivalence. And so it may not be that the patients are being turned off. They're just becoming ambivalent because they're not sure how to resolve this conversation where their values feel like they're under threat, and some of the things they firmly believed are being challenged.
Yeah. There's a great book, and I can't remember the author, but it's called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's that's sort of at the heart really of this cognitive dissonance, isn't it? And so this does happen, but this doesn't happen a lot with patients. I find, I don't know, maybe 10% of my patients, if I had to guess, have this real cognitive dissonance, but it's probably at our heart what we fear the most, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, these are some of the strategies that we can use. We can just start at it slowly. We can give them more of a lived experience of change through their body before they start to understand and can put some language around what's happening in their nervous system as that happens. You choose your battles. I will remember to this, to my dying day, the 62-year-old man that I had in my office, who said to me that his deep buttock pain started when he dislocated his SI joint standing up from a camping chair. And of course, I had to go into how that's not physiologically possible. And we started talking about that. Well, his belief that that is what triggered his pain was so highly ingrained that he literally did this to me. He sat back, he crossed his arms, and he just put this barrier up. I mean, that was so dissonant for him that I had to. Now, we ended up having a great therapeutic alliance. And over time, we played the long game. And he now understands that his SI joint is not that fragile. But, I really had to choose my battles and decide, when to expose them to how much information. So I think that's key as well.
Yeah. And I think that so often, with the best intentions, a lot of times the patient's story is just being replaced with the clinical narrative, being replaced with the right narrative.
Right.
And that's very distressing when you're that person, because we live our stories. We are the stories that we tell ourselves. And if someone is just telling you, no, everything that you think and believe is wrong about yourself, that is so threatening, and that puts up those barriers. And we've talked previously about the importance of that, listening to the person in pain's story, and then finding those inroads to be able to work together towards changing what that narrative might be. But just replacing, and I've done the same thing. When I learned pain science, I was like, no, like if you just know all of this, you're going to be better. And it didn't work out that way.
Right. So playing the long game, really just choosing your battles and grading exposure to education, like we grade exposure to movement. I think that's really important as well. All right, so let's look at, that's one potential barrier that we run into. Another barrier, and again, I wonder if one of you wanted to speak to this a little bit, is really, are they interested? Are they curious to learn more? And what does that look like, right? So,
and coming from a clinical perspective and trying not to cover the clinical narrative, the client's narrative with a clinical narrative, one of the most powerful things you can do is create some curiosity. Open-ended questions. And it doesn't even have to be towards, what do you believe or not believe? What do you think of this? But you can say, I'm curious where this came from. I'm curious how you feel when you talk about this. I'm curious to know if you want some more information about this. Something just coming from that idea. And whenever I think that I want to tell somebody something that I feel is really important, I need to turn it into some sort of a curiosity question to
Mm-hmm.
see if I can gain their trust or their interest, you know, into that kind of subject that's coming up.
And
I
just
think
being interested and curious about them as a person can open
Mhm.
up avenues that if you're only focused on the problem and you're not curious about the person, so much might get missed in that. And from the patient perspective, when you're in pain for a long time, to be able to be interested and curious can be a really difficult thing because your capacity is so limited. That that I think the next slide that we go into will go into those important things. Like it needs to be new and complex and unexpected to gain that interest and curiosity, to make someone go, ooh, like I want to know more about that. But then it also needs to be something that they can understand. There has to be an ease of being able to receive that knowledge, and it has to be coherent and concrete and all of those things too.
Yeah, and I think that it goes back to that cognitive dissonance again. If we are curious enough to really understand their story, then we can also understand where their beliefs come from. And that allows, again, this therapeutic alliance to start to be built around, you don't have to believe what I believe, but even can we tweak your beliefs just enough to serve you in a way that doesn't continue to require this overprotectiveness, perhaps, right? So
Explore these different possibilities, these
yeah.
different possible ways of understanding this.
Yeah.
The idea of curiosity and exploration, I just love and think it's so important when it comes to actually having someone learn in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think when you get curious about their story and their journey, you can find different things in there that don't make sense, you know, that don't add up. So it doesn't hurt when I'm doing this, but it does hurt when I'm doing this. And sometimes they're the similar kind of biomedical or biomechanical type of process. And it's interesting to be able to ask, you know, you talked about this not hurting and this hurting. What do you think the difference is?
Right.
You know, and really trying to get their perspective on it, because they're not, you know, maybe they know, maybe they don't know, but it helps you kind of begin to let them know that you really are interested in who they are and how they're attending to these things, and not so much like, wow, that doesn't make sense.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. I always love vacation mode when my patients go on vacation mode soon into their treatment time frame with me, because invariably they come back and they'll say, when I was away, I felt great. I had no pain. And so again, then we start to get curious. Well, tell me what was different about that time. Let's look at that a little bit more, right? So yeah, I mean, weaving their stories and their experiences into what you're educating them on is just so important.
Yeah.
Right. So then we come to kind of framing a problem, and how we frame a problem as a clinician and how our patients frame the problem can really start to direct how well they're able to actually move through that process, and how much self-efficacy they actually have in that piece. And so it starts with us. If we have still a very strong biomedical belief, let's say in low back pain and the structural sort of components and contributors to low back pain, then we are going to potentially create more fear, more protection in our patients kind of in that process. So we frame the problem in a certain way, we're more likely to direct our patients' framing of that problem. So it has to start with us. And I think for a lot of clinicians, it's that comfort level of, we're not fragile. Our backs are not fragile, because that's not what we've been taught through. I mean, I've been a physio for 33 years, and probably for 25 of those 33 years, I was really good at protecting my own back and all my patients' back. Like I was on guard, like here's the lumbar roll and don't flex, and you know, and
right.
So, but my view had to change in order to help my patient change their view. So that's part of it, I think. Any comments or thoughts on that?
I totally, go ahead. I totally agree. And I think that that's where we were talking earlier about conformational biases, that as a clinician, I think we need to recognize our own cognitive dissonance.
Right.
and to be able to say, do I really believe, am I having trouble with this because I am still in conflict with it? Is it really fear that my clients won't accept this, or is it because I'm still having some problems with the understanding of this material as well, which is perfectly valid.
Right.
And being able to like understand, like when I start to talk about this, how do I feel inside? Am I nervous? Am I upset? Do I believe it? Do I think I'm like, playing the Joker card? What's going on here? And I think that helps when being kind of that effective piece of you when you're talking to the client is how you're actually framing that problem up. Because they can read right through you.
Right.
They really can.
Yeah.
They're watching you and they're listening to your words and to what you're saying to them. And, when you're kind of in conflict yourself, it becomes a little bit more difficult to really create that co-narrative.
Well, and you can start to become fixated on those easier kind
Mhm.
of explanations, that those kind of fallbacks in the biomechanical and biomedical
Mhm.
space. And then that becomes the wrong problem to solve for. And a lot of times patients have been solving for that problem for years and years and years,
Mhm.
from medications and injections and surgery and whatever else it might be to fix whatever that biomedical problem that was identified. And it's just the wrong problem for them to be solving for, and it doesn't take into that the consideration that whole person that is experiencing this pain, and it leaves so few options for moving forward, and that just robs people of hope. If you run out of all options, then you're told there's nothing else that we can do because the problem that we're solving for isn't the right one.
Yeah. Not sure what's wrong. Nothing we can do.
Yeah, nothing that I can see within my narrow lens of looking at this problem is there. So there's nothing wrong with you, or there's nothing we can do is often the default.
So what we've been kind of talking about here is just kind of getting stuck in this perseverance loop. We were having this discussion earlier. Is it perseverance or perseverance? But if you're in Pittsburgh, it's perseverance. And Joletta and I both agreed it was perseverance. So whichever way you want to say it, we can kind of get stuck in this loop that continues to sensitize the neuroimmune response, right? And, one of our roles, I think, in effective pain education is to start to, knock chinks in their armor around their belief and their narrative and their story and being stuck in this loop. But again, how we do that can become the biggest challenge, really, right?
Yeah. And that's where education can play a role too, because when you're stuck in that loop, your worry goes up, and that's part of the diagram in the paper itself that we're referencing here. When the worry goes up, then the hypervigilance can go up, and then it just becomes worse and worse and worse, and you don't have a better explanation for it. And the educational part within that patient's story, within, the things, being curious about who they are as people and their understanding of their problem, can start to stop that perseverance loop at that worry stage, where if you can lower their worry, you can lower some of that hypervigilance and start solving for a different problem. It opens up a different window of possibility.
Right. And I think as well that we, this is where sort of low self-efficacy might also start to show up, right? We get stuck in this loop, and the research shows that people with chronic pain are good problem solvers. They really do strive to, solve their problem. But when they kind of get stuck, then they become hopeless and helpless and worried and anxious. And then their self-efficacy can start to suffer as a result, right? And then if we hop in, especially in a biomedical sort of framework, and try and fix tissues or have that sort of, milieu in our therapeutic environment, then again, we're feeding into that perseverance loop of self-helplessness, and this needs to be fixed, and really we are doing more harm than good at that point. That's where I think therapy can be very harmful potentially.
Right. And this is like the traffic circle, which is why I love this picture, because on the superhighway of what their brain is, they've built this loop, and it's not them that built it. It's their old brain that has built this loop out of protection. And when we add to it, we can make that loop stronger, or can we help the person begin to create bypasses in that loop?
Mhm.
So they can be that car on the right driving off down the highway in the
Right.
other direction
Right.
and not
Yeah.
being caught in the loop. And that's a lovely visual for that kind of thing, because it does
Yeah.
mimic what the central nervous system does.
Exactly. So that's another barrier that we need to really think about. And then, of course, Mike Stewart, who we're going to interview, we're all really excited. Both interviews will be in March, and you will, as an audience, be able to join us on March 20th for a live interaction with Mike Stewart. And Mike Stewart is a brilliant educator. I really enjoy listening to him talk about education and metaphors and pain education. I really think he's one of the most knowledgeable people on this subject, and he's just a delight. So please join us for that for sure. But here's a great article that Mike Stewart wrote on being stuck in the middle and how patients are often immobilized because they have experts around them, people they trust, their physician, their physiotherapist, their chiropractor, who have all these differing opinions. And even though the evidence has been building for the last 10 or 15 years that we need to take a broader look and broader approach, like a biopsychosocial approach in persistent pain, that's not happening from an interdisciplinary perspective. And there's very little collaboration in the pain world because it's timely, it's costly, it's not efficient, we're not operating in the same spaces. And all of those things can lead to patients being stuck in the middle, which then leaves them immobile as well and with low self-efficacy. Joletta, do you have any comments from your own experience around that piece?
Well, it's always interesting when I reflect back on all of the things that I've been told about what was the cause of my pain. It all depended on the clinician that I was going to, therapist that I was going to, and the lens that they were looking through. And even within the physical therapy world, if you're just looking at that world, I went to half a dozen different physical therapists, and the explanations were all different, and the approach was all different, and it becomes really, really confusing. And then you just start to feel more and more dysfunctional and broken. Because, I was told I had dysfunctional movement. My SI joint was dysfunctional. I had all these dysfunctions that were, and a lot of them, learning later, a lot of them were made up kind of dysfunctions. It's just like a term used when we can't explain something. We're just going to call something dysfunctional.
Dysfunction. Right.
Yeah. I mean, even down to movement. Yeah. To like diagnose movement dysfunctions. It's just heartbreaking to me now, like in retrospect. But you're stuck in the middle of all those, and then that keeps you in that loop too, that perseverance loop, where you're solving for the wrong problems all the time because you don't have a clear idea of what the problem even is, and you're chasing all of these problems that have been identified by all of these different experts that are often at odds with each other or not aligned with each other. And it just becomes really confusing. And it's no wonder to me that patients do become more passive and that they lose self-efficacy because they're not given any power. They're not given, explanations that empower them to do things themselves, to be able to move forward, or to empower them with the knowledge and understanding of what their condition is or what they're experiencing, to allow them to live their lives with the pain that they might have. So yeah, it's a difficult situation for patients to be in, and it would be a dream for everyone to get on the same page and the understanding of what is going on, especially when it comes to persistent pain. Yeah.
And I think that goes along with what we talked about earlier about cognitive dissonance. And if the professionals aren't agreeing, and our clients, all of these beautiful people are problem solvers. They're going and asking questions and trying to figure this out. And every time they get more conflicting clinical outlooks, that creates more dissonance. And that dissonance creates the ambivalence. And so
then you just give up.
Right. And even in our own profession, we can't agree.
Right.
Yeah.
And we build empires, we build silos, we build treatment strategies, and a lot of the sort of being stuck in the middle is around protecting our territory, right? And if that is the driver in not putting the patient at the forefront and moving them forward through this difficult journey, then we need to think about that more critically, right? And say, where can we work together? You know, is there a broader framework that we can use that maybe, Susan, you know, we use as physiotherapists maybe different manual therapy techniques and different kind of manual therapy or mechanical approaches, but I know for certain that your and my framework is the same. And so, and our language is as clean as it can be. You know, it's not that it's perfect because we, you know, we've had 30 plus years of clinical practice of talking about dysfunctions, Joletta. And so, you know, we're cleaning up our language and cleaning up, you know, how we explain things to patients. But maybe it's a little bit less about the technique that we use, but more about the framework that we put that technique in, right?
Yeah.
I agree completely. Instead of stabilize, mobilize, you know, it's much more about input and output.
Right.
And what do you see that's different now?
Yeah. Yeah.
But really working with the patient, the client's ability to really understand, to feel that and understand that.
Yeah.
In that way, I think Eric Franklin's a master of that. He calls it consumer comparison. And that's a wonderful term because what does it feel like now? Let's do this. That graded exposure you talked about to movement or graded exposure to communication. How do you feel about that now?
Right.
What does that movement feel like now? You know, did it change?
Right. That is a lived experience of change, right?
Yeah.
And when we actually take the time, that's pain education. When we take the time to say, how do I feel right now? Let's try this. Let's not put any dysfunctional reasoning behind why we're trying this. And then let's pay attention afterwards. Does that feel better, worse, or the same, right?
Yeah.
Which is where I'm going to go back to my mechanical stuff and always going back to here's a movement. When you're done, I mean, I've done consumer comparisons my whole career. I didn't call it that. You know, it's so interesting because I've been fascinated with Eric Franklin's work for probably a decade. And it wasn't until I went to the combined sections meeting, I don't know, that was in San Diego about 5 or 6 years ago. Yeah, 7 years ago, that he taught a course. The only thing I took away from the course, because I'd read all his books already, was the consumer comparison.
But
that
was one thing for me.
It was the thing that changed my clinical practice, because if we don't pay attention to how something influences our nervous system, we've lost a learning opportunity. We've lost an educational moment, right? And so I do that. All my patients, are we doing another consumer comparison? You bet we are. Let's pay attention and see what's going on. All right, so that's stuck in the middle, and that's a real challenge. I think that's maybe one of our bigger challenges, to be really honest, right?
And it creates those other barriers that, like Susan was saying, that dissonance and that ambivalence, because you're just being told another new thing to replace your story.
Right.
It all feeds back. It's its own perseverance loop.
It is, isn't it? We're just talking in circles here. Literally, we're getting on that traffic circle, and we're just going to keep going around. And then I think and Mike Stewart's going to speak to this brilliantly when we speak to him, and maybe we'll leave a lot of it, you know, kind of in his words. But you know, the idea of Joletta, you said some really interesting words earlier about metaphors, or was it Susan, one of the two, about how we all speak in metaphors and our patients speak in metaphors, but are we listening to their metaphors and their stories? And then how do they learn? Like, you know, we need to meet their learning style. And often as physiotherapists, even though we educate patients all day, what do we really know about education? Like, do we know the principles of good educational strategies? I'm an educator. I do a lot of postgraduate courses, and you know, I have a lot to learn yet about educational strategy. And I'm hoping to spend more time with Mike and hang out with him a little bit more and you know, figure out some of that stuff a bit better, because we need to do it for ourselves as well, right?
Yeah, and I think it's such a good point that Susan made about we all speak in metaphors, and the medical field is rife with metaphor, and we don't think about that. You know, the heart is a pump, the pelvic floor, all of these things are metaphors too. So it's not just patients coming in with metaphors or metaphors about pain. We just speak in general in metaphor, and that's how we come to understand things. So that can provide, you know, a huge insight into what the self-generated metaphors that a person in pain comes with can provide so many insights into their understanding of their experience, and then provide a path forward for coming up with, you know, a new window or new possibility, a different way of explaining what's happening or approaching how to solve for the right problem,
Right.
Through using their own language and the imagery and words and metaphors that they're using.
I had this visualization all of a sudden of being back in math class. Are we solving for X? Are we solving for Y? Are we solving for Z? Like, what are we? But we have all these different ways that, once you get into some of that higher level functional math, there's not always a right answer, right? There's many different pathways to that right answer. And I think the same is true for our patients.
Which is
Susan,
why linguistics is
yeah.
so fantastic. And I think your next slide kind of speaks to that, because not only is it just English, but it's cultural.
Yeah.
And what means something in different cultures. And so some people will say, well, this certain culture, they are more sensitive to pain than this culture. And it's like, maybe it's not that at all. Maybe it's the words have a different meaning for them than they do for this culture over here. And I think the slide speaks to it beautifully.
Can you read the slide a little bit for those who aren't actually watching?
Sure. So Western mechanistic and invasive kinds of language: shooting, stabbing, lancinating, pounding, burning, crushing, pinching, all of those kinds of words we use a lot, at least in the Western culture here. And the one you have up next to it is from Japanese, and it all comes from natural environmental expressions. So they will talk about bear headaches, which resembles heavy steps of a bear. I wouldn't even begin to know what a bear headache was without that explanation.
Right.
Deer headaches, like a galloping of a deer. Headaches with a chill. Octopus headache, sucking. And this is my favorite one, crab headache, prickling. That we would say paresthesias, numbness and tingling. Those kinds of things, but they use the natural and environmental metaphors to describe what's actually happening to them, and they have deep meaning to them.
Right. And so it's so interesting, I find, as we know, kind of Eastern cultures are much more sort of mind-body aware and interconnected, sort of mind-body-soul a little bit more. Whereas you can see even in Western metaphors and descriptors, we can see our cultural beliefs that pain is due to a biomechanical problem, like shooting, stabbing, pounding, burning, so it's their language teaches us so much. And then using metaphor for them to start to understand more complex structures or concepts is also important. So,
and that's interesting, because the Western one that you see there with the shooting, stabbing, lancinating almost implies, at least to me, that something has been done to
you. Yeah,
right.
Me too.
And this one is like, my pain is like the galloping of a deer.
Right.
It's not like the deer gave me the headache.
Right. The deer's pounding on my head.
Right. But instead, but see, as from a Western point of view, they might take that meaning as that. Whereas they're just trying to come up with a metaphor that will describe something to them that means, like, probably what we would use as the word maybe pounding.
Right. Yeah. So I can't wait to learn a little bit more about metaphors yet from Mike. Next time we talk, we'll delve into that a little bit more. And I think the other point we wanted to make was language is important and metaphors are really important, but so is the lived experience of change and its ability. And we've referenced this a couple of times as well, but its ability, especially when we use the consumer comparison that Susan Clinton talked about, that Eric Franklin teaches us, gives us a chance to actually get them to notice how their pain changes with different movements and different practices and different breath patterns. And as they understand that, they need to start, it's kind of like being on vacation mode. So what changed your pain while you were on vacation mode? Well, in all likelihood, you had less stress, you were out of your regular routine, all of those things that have now become mapped with your pain response have changed, right? And so I think a lot of these novel movement practices also give us the opportunity to give our patients lived experience of change, which may actually at a gut level, an experiential level, be more impactful than words even sometimes.
Yeah, because the visualization too is I have come to understand more and more about it. The more it's individual to the client for them to create their own visualization, which speaks to what I've learned from Joletta so much about not putting my clinical narrative on top of theirs. Like, I shouldn't give them my visualization, but maybe even ask them, can you create, just, I'll give you an example, but what is, what can you create that might visualize you feeling lighter, or this or that or whatever, and let them, because it has to be personal from what I understand, or it's more impactful if it's personal. And, so which I just think is, because that speaks to that combined narrative rather than you have a pound mine on top of you, and it may not speak to them at all, especially if we think about those cultural differences.
Yeah, it reminds me of Rachel Naomi Remen's book, Kitchen Table Wisdom. There's a story in there about a cancer patient who was given a visualization exercise that there were sharks like going through and eating all the cancer cells, and he just couldn't do it. It didn't resonate with him at all.
Right.
But when Dr. Remen was speaking with him, like what resonated with him was like catfish. Was it catfish? I think it was catfish. Like like catfish, because they're the bottom feeders,
they're the bottom suckers, right?
Yeah, they clean up like all the debris and all the stuff that's not supposed to be there. So for him, that made much more sense. But when he in this particular program, they were trying to force the shark visualization on him, which meant nothing to him, and he could never do it. But once it was changed to the catfish one, he was all on board. And it's just such a simple thing. Like, just what speaks to you? What would make sense for you to visualize in your own body? Just a simple question to change it up.
That's amazing.
Coming from a place of curiosity.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes.
Can we replace fear with curiosity? That's what I say to my patients all the time. Can we be curious? And so the last barrier that we're just going to wrap up with is really just looking at context. And I have a little story to tell here. So this, if you're watching the video talk instead of the audio talk, you'll see a metaphor for endometriosis, where there's a uterus and the fallopian tubes and the ovaries, with a chainsaw cutting through the uterus and a sharp knife kind of in the hand of one kind of fallopian tube and a razor in the other hand, cutting. And so this was actually a metaphor that the advocacy groups came up. I was invited to speak at the US Patient Day for advocacy groups in 2018 before the IASP conference. And their job in this particular day conference was to come up with some metaphors that they could use in their community to help their community communicate with loved ones and their family doctors and the medical people around them around what it was like, for example, to live with endometriosis, right? And my observation to this was, as I was talking to them about a biopsychosocial framework and the importance of looking at stress and distress, as well as sort of the bio components, they actually shut me down pretty darn quickly, because they had heard for long enough that this was in their head. And they were trying to represent in their metaphor here how physical their pain was. And it was actually a tissue problem that needed to be resolved, right? And so that was their context. And although, their context represented kind of their own journey as advocates, I was somewhat concerned as a clinician to kind of hear that this is where the advocacy groups were at, because it's not very hopeful, right? I think we have a lot of evidence that we can provide these groups hope, but their own context was creating this biomechanical, almost hopeless, we just have to learn to live with it kind of process. And, I find it really interesting sometimes too, that these advocacy groups are often led by people who they themselves altruistically give so much of their time, that have suffered with the same condition, but have failed to actually sort of move sort of beyond the condition, I guess. And Joletta, you probably have some comments on this for sure, but I'm looking at it from a place of hopefulness. And I wonder sometimes with the advocacy groups, if they're kind of entrenched in this biomedical, it can't get better, we just need recognition for the condition, because they've been so under-recognized.
Yeah. Well, and part of what this screams to me in the context of you being there as well, is that cry for legitimacy and being validated, and having people understand that their pain is very real.
Right.
Like that's what I see. It's just they want people to know that their pain is real. They want to be validated. And they probably haven't gotten that. And I think that does keep people stuck, because validation, it really is a first step to being able to move forward. So if you're constantly having to fight to be seen and heard and believed and validated, then that's where the fight is always going to be. And I hope that that's changing. I hope that now, like National Geographic's current issue is there's a huge bit on pain. So pain is on the cover, and it's the special feature within National Geographic for the current issue. So I think that our understanding collectively as a society is starting to change. And I think that it's starting to change in healthcare too. But in that, when we were talking about being stuck in the middle, patients are still being told that their pain isn't real and that it's all in their head. And it's really hard to counter those narratives. And then you're fighting for your own human decency when you're there. You're fighting for your not just the validity of your pain, but your validity as a human being and your value as a human being. I'm hoping that with the current state of things, we're moving forward and moving away from dismissing and disbelieving and not validating patients' experiences, and starting to understand that their pain is what they say it is.
Yeah, I think I'm very hopeful as well. I do see the tide changing, which is great. I think we have a lot of work to do. But I think there's a lot of great people working at it from many different angles in many different countries in many different ways. And that collective movement forward can only be a positive thing, because patients have everything to gain, right?
Yeah.
We do as healthcare.
Changing those societal narratives and the understanding in society and for employers and all of that is so important too. Like it's beyond just the realm of healthcare. So it's pretty exciting to see that National Geographic has a big issue on pain, and that these things are starting to hit mainstream media, and that it's being talked about in different ways is really hopeful too. And hopefully will give people surrounding people that living with pain a different understanding of that experience, and be able to help them to move forward too.
Because I think mainstream media can raise questions that clients may not have thought about, or they're thinking about in secret. And they can
legitimizes it, doesn't it? When
those questions are exactly what I have.
That's what I hear all the time.
What about that?
On my blog, it's like I was always so shocked when people would say you're writing my thoughts, because my experience seems so personal and so specific. And we just haven't done a very good job at getting those stories out there. And that's why I think that people sharing their stories and their experiences and sharing their hope and their way forward too is really, really helpful for people. And that peer support, which might be
the next topic.
Genius project, could be such a powerful way forward too. When you have people who are living well with pain, who have been in the darkness and despair but found a path forward, that could be such a powerful way of helping people to make sense of their experience and to move forward with their experience too.
Well stated. So on that note, let's wrap up today's discussion. Thank you both, Gillette and Susan, for your thoughts and wisdom. And we are excited to be speaking with Mike in about a month's time, and then with Mike again on March 20th. So mark that in your calendar, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can go ahead and email us, go on the website, email us, and we will send you a link to that discussion. And you can be part of the live discussion with Mike around some of these challenges that we face as clinicians. So until then, enjoy, and thanks, ladies, for a great discussion.
Thank you.